Hey everyone, so I'm Anil, and in this video, we're going to learn how we can create an automated quiz generation workflow, right? And so the generation will be done using LLMs being part of that workflow. So basic idea is think, you're a content creator or a teacher, and you want to create a quiz. You kind of have a topic, you give it the level and the number of questions, and we'll add to this any info you have. So if you have notes, you can pass that as well. And what you get at the end of it is an interactive web page, right? So it's not just a quiz, you get a web page which students can click on and see the answers now, right? So and then I'll give you suggestions how you can extend this to make it an actual kind of serious full stack app, right? If you want, that can just be suggestions. So the basic idea here is that we're going to use the OpenAI API, and what we need when we kind of call the OpenAI API is the model you want to call, then the information you want to pass it in the form of messages. Tools is another parameter that goes into that, but we're not using that because this is not agentic. And what we want from that is the content. And if you want, you can extract how many tokens you use so you can calculate your cost, right? In this case, we're not going to worry too much about the cost. It's a very early tutorial. So let's start by setting up our workflow. As we know, workflows consists of nodes, and then you have to define the connections between the nodes. So we have our inputs coming in, and then the first node, right, is again, it uses an LLM. So it's an LLM powered node. And what it is a lesson generator, which takes in topic, level, and any extra information you want to give the AI LLM. And what it is supposed to give you is the lesson. So we're first creating a lesson from the topic and the info. And so these three will obviously then be inputs, right? Then you have the next node, which is a quiz generator. So what this is supposed to do is take the lesson. So we've pre-processed the initial information into a lesson, take the lesson and the level and the number of questions that quiz should have, and it returns a quiz. And then the last step is what takes in the quiz generated by the quiz generator. In this case, this node does not need to know that at the moment. It takes in the quiz, and what it gives you is the web page, right? So we've broken this basic web page generation, quiz web page generation into three pieces. So let's now go and kind of code this up quickly, kind of create our nodes. Then we'll come back and explore the data connections and how the flow of control happens, meaning the edges are defined, right? And so we're going to build this using the Laeyerz library. If you've seen, the previous video, the first video in this series where we kind of explored what a workflow is, we've used that there. So it's an open source, well, it's a library we've set up to kind of help you get prototyping with workflows and agents. You can go check it out at GitHub, Pixagon Laeyerz. It's open source. So to install it, go there. You can, hit the code button. You can see there how to clone it. Basically, do git clone this and then cd into that repository and install it using pip install -e. Pip install Laeyerz is not yet functional in terms of directly installing from pip. That should be up, soon when I have the time to set it up. So let's now go and set up our nodes, and then we'll be back. Okay, so we've opened up our Jupyter notebooks. And this is what I'm going to use to kind of code up this workflow. Now, we've already talked about installing Laeyerz from Git, so hopefully you've been able to do that. We're also calling OpenAI's API, so you need to install that using pip install OpenAI. And then to call OpenAI, we've written a small wrapper around the OpenAI API, kind of to allow us to kind of call it easy and integrate it with workflows, including future videos, right? So you'll see that in a repository called GitHub Pixagon Laeyerz nodes, right? So when I build custom, workflow components, I call them nodes and I put it there for, especially for our tutorials. And so you can go ahead, check that out. I'll just show you the repository in a second. And then what you do is go ahead, once you clone it, you can go in and do an install -e again, and that should get you going. So this is the Laeyerz GitHub repository, GitHub Pixagon Laeyerz nodes, and you can see this repo here. I've just created it recently, and it has a number of different nodes, right? So for different tasks. So some of these we'll see in future demos. So we want LLM and we want OpenAI, right? And what it does is it gives you a way to connect. So it's just writing on top of this. So you need to have OpenAI installed, but it allows you to create a Laeyerz style node. Some of this is pre-built, right? I've written the inputs and outputs. We're not going to use it in this video, but in future videos it will make it super easy to kind of instantiate an LLM node, and we're going to use the call LLM function to allow us to call this LLM node. Okay, so you've seen that, and you can check out this in other nodes and maybe create your own, when you build interesting demos. Okay, so let's get back to a Jupyter notebook. Okay, so now what we need is, because we need to read the API key, we're going to use what is called a key manager, right? So a key manager is a utility in Laeyerz. And so typically when you get an API key from OpenAI or any other API key, you create a .env file and you can store the API key. So in this case, I'd recommend storing it as OpenAI API key, because, and kind of storing it equal to this. Or you can have an env.json and then store it in the JSON format, right? Like this. So what the key manager does is, if you say km is equal to key manager, give it the path to your env file. And in this case, I have just used an env.json. And what it will do is go ahead and load the API key. So you don't have to use .env and so on. And then what we do is we create our LLM node. So from Laeyerz nodes.llm.openai node, get OpenAI node. And I'm importing it as LLM. So I'll say LLM node is equal to LLM. What you have to do in these nodes is give it a name. I'm just calling it LLM, but you can give it, any name. It's an identifier. And then say config is equal to, and the configuration is a dictionary. And in this case, for the OpenAI node, it takes in the API key, which you can get from key manager by saying km square brackets and the name of the key. So I'm assuming you've stored it as OpenAI API key. Give that, and that will get the key. And then provide the model that you want to use. So I'm using GPT-5 mini, and that sets up the LLM connector, and we can then use that, right, to set up our functions. We also need flow and node from Laeyerz, right? So we use node to set up our nodes. So let's start setting up our first node. Our first node is the lesson generator, right? So what we want is to tell the AI to generate some lessons. So we need to set up, I'm using the OpenAI's chat API. And so you say messages, you want to give it some developer instructions, and then tell it the topic is this topic and the level is this. And if any info is provided, then, and I'm using a different message for that, you can also restructure this prompt to write it differently. But so additional lesson content is this. So what are the instructions to the LLM? And that tells the LLM what to do with all of this information. So that's what we are passing in here as developer. We say, given the topic level specified, generate the lesson. If info is specified, use it to, to improve your lesson. Use it as your lesson. Now, when you say role developer, the LLM treats it as instructions to the LLM, and then content is what, or role user is what, is the input to the LLM on which it has to use these instructions, right? So we do that. We say messages.append, and then we use the Laeyerz node that I've set up above. So it just says call LLM, and you pass in messages. If you are going agentic, just have tools, you pass in tools, right? In this case, just messages. You get the response, and if you say response message dot content, it'll extract the response for you, which in this case is the lesson. So let's just go run all of these. I haven't run these yet, so let's just go run these, run the key manager, run the LLM node, and then got the function, right? So we've got the first function, which is going to take in topic level info and give out the lesson. Now we have to convert it into a node. So we've just imported node from Laeyerz. We create a lesson node object. We give it a name, and this name is very important because it is what we'll use when we define our edges, right, and data connections. So we say that, we instantiate the lesson node, we give it the inputs, we tell it what the inputs are. Again, if you've used something like LangGraph, you think this is implicit here, but in this case, we are specifying it explicitly. Later on, I can update, Laeyerz so that it does that automatically. But for now, give it the name of the input, the type, and the description is typically if you're using this as a skill as part of an agent. So not relevant here, but do that. For now, let's just keep it that way. So we give it topic, we give it level, and we tell it the third input is info. All three at the moment we're saying are strings, right? We also have to tell or define what the outputs of the node are. So lesson outputs, the name is lesson and the type is string. Once we have set up what the inputs and outputs are for the node, right, we have to give it to the node, right? We have just set this up as a dictionary. So what do? We say, well, lesson node.set function, which is what you use, give the function a name. So I'm using the same name as the actual function name we have defined here, lesson generator. So I'm saying the name is, and this name along with the node name is what you'll do to define the data connections and the control flow as edges. So I say set function, give it the name, give it the function. This is for parameters. We have no parameters here. Inputs and outputs, and your node is set. So next is the next node, which is the quiz generator. Now the quiz generator, as we're seeing there, takes in concept, level, and number of questions, where concept is the lesson generated previously, right? So what I'm going to do is say the instructions to the LLM are convert the concept into a quiz using the number of questions, and at the level specified only use the information provided. So previously in the lesson generator, I'm allowing it to create its own content as well, apart from taking info, right? Because if you don't give info, what does it do? In this case, I'm saying you cannot create your own content. You have to use the lesson you've been given to create the quiz. Defining the output format by saying you have to give it in this format, say n questions, and then give the questions, options, and the correct answer, right? That's how it's supposed to respond. Okay, and so now the LLM, the messages to the LLM, the developer, the role developer, you give the instructions above, and then in the user, you tell it what the concept is, the level, and the number of questions. So we use the call LLM of the LLM node, pass in the messages, and from response message content, we extract quiz. So it's very similar to the node we have set up above, but now this is doing something different, right? We have to set up the inputs, outputs, and the node next. So we say quiz node, which is defining the node, is node, and the name is quizzer. The inputs, as we've seen, are concept, level, and number of questions, and the output is quiz, which is the quiz in this format we have asked it to return, right? I'm saying string because I'm not going to, if I did a JSON.decode here, if I said JSON.loads, then what you would see is this quiz then being converted to JSON. Even though I'm asking you to respond in the JSON format, I'm not converting it to JSON. It's just so that the HTML generator sees it in that format, and HTML generators generally work better with structured JSON-like formats, right? So once I've set up the inputs and outputs, let's kind of pass the function over to the node. So quiz node.set function, quiz generator, it's the name, pass the function, pass the parameters, inputs and outputs, right? So that is that. And then the last node we have to set up is the actual web page generator, right? So it just takes in the quiz, and the instructions are you'll be provided a quiz in JSON, convert it into interactive HTML, right? And keep the answer hidden. So when he hits the submit button, the student, he or she, you show the correct answer. So the messages now are the instructions and the quiz. This is the developer, this is the user. Same call LLM node.call LLM, get out the content, which is the HTML page. And again, we are returning the HTML page as a string, right? We're not doing any extraction here. The idea being that if this is at the back of an API or something, you can return the HTML as a string. We define the node, we set up the inputs and outputs. You should probably have got the hang of this by now. And then we kind of pass the function name, inputs and outputs to the node. So we've set up the nodes. We haven't set up the workflow though, right? So let's go ahead and do that quickly. To do that, say quizgen is equal to flow, which we've just imported from Laeyerz, quiz generator, which is the name or the tag of the flow. So that's kind of useful, important if you are handling multiple flows. So not at the moment, not in this example, but if you have multiple workflows, Again, you use the name to track what's happening, right? And then once you create the workflow, use add node to add the nodes above. So we've got 3 nodes. So we say add node lesson node, add node quiz node, add node HTML node. And that adds the 3 nodes to the workflow. So that's about it. We've defined our nodes. Next, we have to set up the connections. Okay, so we've set up our nodes. Now let's see how the data is connected. We know what each node needs. Where do these inputs come from, right? So our first node is a lesson generator. Now, in this case, it's the first node. The information it takes is directly from the inputs to the workflow. So to the workflow, you have to give topic, info, and level. All 3 go into lesson, right? And what lesson returns, or the lesson generator returns, is the lesson output. Now the quiz generator, the inputs for that are that lesson along with level and number of questions, right? So the inputs to this, basically there is one data connection to the previous node and then 2 that directly get pulled in from the inputs by the Laeyerz orchestrator. And then the last node, which is the web page generator, it actually, in this particular example, only takes in the quiz generated by the quiz generator, no other input. And what it does is give you the web page. So we've defined the connections in terms of data flow between the nodes. If you want to extend the page generator, you can add another input called web page style, where you can pass in the logo and so on. But I think this is good enough for now. So let's now go implement this and we'll be back. So next we have to set up the edges, right? Like we said, the data connections rather. So setting up the data connections is pretty straightforward. You say quizgen.add data source, and then first the receiver node, meaning where the data is coming into. So in this case, the first node is lesson. We're setting up the inputs for lesson. So lesson is a node name. Lesson generator is the function name. Topic is the input that we're passing into. Where's the value coming from? Right, because the node just notes the inputs are coming in. Where is it coming from? Well, the orchestrator needs to go to inputs. So the inputs to the workflow are stored in inputs. So it needs to go to inputs and get the value topic and pass it here, right? So when the orchestrator runs, it says using the flow of control we'll define below, it goes to the first node, which is lesson generator. Says, okay, this node needs topic from the inputs we have set up above. It needs topic and it needs level and info. Well, where do I get topic from? Go to inputs, get topic from there and pass it here, right? So that's the idea of that. Now what we need to do is, it's not got one input, it's got 3, right? So we also need to set up lesson generator level, which goes from inputs level, and lesson generator info, which goes from inputs info. So with that, we have set up the inputs for the first node. What about the next node? Now the next node again is quizzer, and the function that it's going to run is quiz generator. We have concept. Where does that come from? That's the output of the lesson generator, right? The lesson generator generates a lesson, and that's what we're taking in as concept. So we say, well, that's the value or the socket here. What we need to pass in is lesson generator, and the value that's outputting is lesson. So typically an input to a node is an output of a previous node. So this is an output, right, of the previous node. Level and end questions we get from inputs itself. And then what we're left with is the last node, which is web generator or web page generator. What it does, it has one input, quiz. Where does it get that from? It's the output of the quiz generator. So quizzer, quiz generator, quiz is passed into the web page generator. So that's all we need in terms of data connections. We now need to go look at edges. Okay, so finally we have to define the flow of control, right? I like defining the data first because that tells you the flow of control. If this requires information from this, then you have to define or you have to run this node first, and only then can you come here. This is a very straightforward linear workflow. So we have start, which is kind of where the workflow is starting. I'm just setting that up to show you. The first node that's executed is the lesson generator. We know what the inputs are and what it gives you. Then the next edge has to be defined, or the control flow edge has to be defined from lesson generator to quiz generator. That's what's run next. And then finally, once the quiz generator is run, we have what we need for the HTML web page generator. So we run that, or the orchestrator runs that. So we define that edge, and then we're done, right? So we tell it it's done. So it's pretty straightforward in this case. No parallel edges running or no conditional edges, anything like that. we'll see those in future videos, right? So let's go implement this. So what we need to define is the flow of control, which in Laeyerz we're going to do by defining what are called edges, right? So this is actually similar to how you do it in LangGraph, in terms of not exactly the same but similar. It defines the flow of control. So for the first node, you first say add edge, say start. So the orchestrator first looks for start and see what's connected to it. So start, and the node is lesson, and we define the function as well, lesson generator, because in Laeyerz you can have nodes with multiple functions. So in this case, this helps specify which function it is. So we'll see that only in more advanced workflows that we'll experiment with. So add edge, start, lesson generator. So it tells it the first node it has to run is lesson generator. Once it runs lesson generator, it looks for the next connection. So it's you say, okay, I'm going to add an edge between lesson generator and quiz generator. So it looks for this and says, actually from here I have to go to quiz generator, right? So that's the edge going from lesson generator to quiz generator. Then where does it go next? It has to go to the web page builder. So add an edge that goes from quiz generator to web page HTML generator, and we're done. So how do we tell the workflow we're done, or rather the orchestrator we're done? We say, actually once you get to web page HTML generator, go to end, and when it sees end, it realizes the workflow is over. So that's about it. We're done with setting up our flow of control. So as we've seen above, we've set up our nodes, we've set up our data connections and our flow of control, which in this case is pretty elementary. You have more complex cases where you have data control kind of going in parallel to different nodes or conditional nodes and so on. It might become more complicated but also more interesting. Now, what we need to do then is, if we want, define the set of outputs, because typically in workflow builders and definitely in Laeyerz, the way we've set it up, all the outputs of the nodes are stored in what is called an apps or a graph state, right? So once you are done with your workflow, you need to extract that. You can either manually go access the graph state and get it out, or you set outputs, right? So I say the output of the web page HTML generator, which we know is HTML page, we've just seen it above, the output is HTML page. We've defined that here. You need to define the outputs here for it to read that. Once you do that, what it does is when you call, or when you run the workflow, and how you do that is say outputs is quizgen.run and give it a dictionary of inputs. Then this at the end of the workflow, these values specified here, and this is a list, so you can specify more. You can say I want quizgen, quiz generator, something, right? And that it will go and get those values as well from the app state. It will go and return them as a dictionary in outputs. So in this case, I just want the HTML page, and then I run it. So the inputs you provide as a dictionary, we need topic, level, number of questions, and info at the moment is none. So I'm letting it create its own, information. Basically, the AI is responsible for creating the lesson, which I would recommend you, if you have a lesson, you give it the lesson, right? That's a better way to run it. So if I run this, it starts running the workflow, and then we'll wait for it to complete in a second, and then we'll see what the outputs are. So I'm just going to run that as well. Okay, so this is run. It took around a couple of minutes to run, a little less than that, but around that to run. We've got the 3 nodes running, and then I've just print the outputs. So because we have defined set outputs, the outputs actually is a dictionary which has keys, and in this case one key, web page HTML generate HTML page. So that value is exported, and we see the HTML page, right? It's written a pretty nice big website page, web page, and it is interactive, right? And so we'll go take a look at this page in a second. Now, so kind of something for you to experiment with. How do we export this page? Right now I've just written out the HTML. So when I want to export it, I'm just going to say open this file, and file.write outputs, write this, and it's clean HTML, so it will run immediately. The HTML page can then be opened up, double click on that, and it'll open up in a browser like we'll just see. But now I've not made this a node, right? I've kind of just set it up like this. So given you've seen this video, can you now convert this into a 4th node? Do not merge it into the 3rd node, which is the web page generator. That is an LLM call node. Don't add output to that. We want to keep each node as compact as possible. Add a 4th node that takes in the HTML and writes out a file, right? And I've already given you the function. Can you kind of make that, you know, your homework assignment, right? Okay, so hopefully you've enjoyed the making part. Let's just quickly look at our web page and then look at how we can extend this a little further if you want, if you're interested. So you get something like this. It's a neural network quiz. What is a neural network? So let's say I'm going to call it a root. I'm going to say, well, I think it's something like this, and then I'm just going to give it random answers, right? Let's not waste a lot of time. I'm just, and I hit submit. You want some right and some wrong answers. So you see in the correct answer, it says correct. I just randomly hit these. So it says the correct answer is softmax, right? So I've got a lot of them wrong. It says I've got 215. It's very good. And I can hit reset and I can start again. So you see how it's created a simple web page. Obviously the challenge here is this is not coming from a backend. So what more can you do to improve this? Let's take a look. Okay, so we've seen how our workflow has run. We've given it the inputs and we've seen what the web page it generates looks like. Now, if you kind of, want to play around with this particular example, you can go ahead, go to GitHub Pixagon, Laeyerz examples. It's a different repository tool, just Laeyerz. And I'll add the URL in the description. You can go ahead and kind of get that code and you can extend it, play around with it, so on. So a few ideas for extension, you can add styling parameters to the page. Make this more production-like. In this case, the quiz is stored in the HTML page, meaning the answers are right there. So, you could send this to people or upload it, to an HTML page renderer, something like that. But the answers are right there. So somebody could cheat. On the other hand, pass the answers to a backend learning LMS management system or to Google Forms, for example, and you could get the question set up there, you could make it shareable and so on. So a lot of ways how you can extend this. I'd find the idea of kind of setting up a backend or using an LMS and passing it there, getting it to render, to be kind of more interesting. So these are ideas you can kind of work around or play around with and extend, right? And so hopefully this tutorial has helped you kind of get an idea of how you can build generative workflows with LLMs as part of them. And in the future videos, we'll see more interesting examples, including where LLMs now start taking decisions or help taking decisions, right? So they play more of a role in terms of controlling the workflow. And then eventually we'll get to agentic workflows. Thank you.